Hi, and welcome to another AI in C# video. Today is a bit different because we're going to do an end-to-end example of something I actually have as real code running out there. Uh, the other videos have more been this new concept, this new feature, and so on. But here we are going to leverage a lot of what we have learned over the other videos, which also means we won't go into too much details on each individual part. But today is all about trying to say, what if you have a C# open source NuGet package and you want to expose it as an MCP server, which is what I want to do and have done. So if we go into it, AI is good at C# if it knows it. So if we started up ChatGPT and asked about some C# code, in my background case here is I make a NuGet package called Trello.net for the Trello board system that exists. They have an API. I have made a C# wrapper around it. And if I ask ChatGPT what that is, it's called Trello.net, it actually knows it, which is nice, of course. ChatGPT have this word knowledge and get the data, and it can even tell you how to install it using NuGet, which is good. But the second I go further, like for example, how to add a new task or what's called a card in Trello.net, it immediately begins to hallucinate and show something that have absolutely nothing with reality. So it knows a little about it, but it doesn't know the intricate details. Same goes if you had a private repo. So what I'm gonna show you is to take Trello.net and actually make an MCP server so you can sit in one of the MCP clients like Microsoft Copilot or Cursor and actually get real code instead of this mess down here. You don't need to know about Trello to follow this video. It's mostly about how do we actually get the data in and so an MCP server can work with it. The flow we are going to use is that we first need to rack the data. I'm going to use a Azure function to do that. And I'm going to use a small NuGet package that I have made myself as well called SimpleRack. And SimpleRack will be its own video at some point. So this video don't become too long. But if you have seen this video end to end and are interested at the end about what happened actually in that magical step, SimpleRack will be its own video. But the first thing Azure Function and SimpleRack will do is it will online grab the sources of GitHub for that specific repo, meaning Trello.net. And then it's gonna embed it into a vector store, in my case, Azure AI Search. And the vector embeddings will be done by Azure OpenAI. And once we have that, we have turned our code into something that we can use for RAG. Then comes along the MCP clients, Visual Studio, Copilot, Studio, Cursor, Claude Code, and all the different MCP tools that are out there. They, of course, want to get hold of this data. So I'm going to use actually the same Azure function and expose the vector data and vector search here as an MCP client so we can work with it. One thing, because this is open source and I don't earn any money on Trello.net, I wanted this to be dirt cheap. So we're using GitHub, that's free for what I use it for. Azure Functions are very, very close to free. The Azure OpenAI embeddings are very cheap as well. It's only when you actually use the real LLM, but the embeddings are very, very cheap. Azure AI Search, which I use here, have a free tier. But if you have, for example, an Azure SQL Server, you could use that instead if you already have one that you pay for. Or you could use Cosmos DB as which also have a free tier. So it is possible to actually get the entire vector store part for free with certain limitations in terms of size of data and so on. And then the end user is actually the one that have the MCP client, Copilot, and so on, and they actually pay for the AI costs. So in order for me to do this, it will actually cost me less than €0.50 a month, and I even think it's lower than that. So it's not like it's free, but it's very, very close to free. So let's jump into some code. And I have my Trello.net assistant, as I call it, and it's just the backend of an Azure function. And that Azure function have a few NuGet packages. It uses its own NuGet packages, and then it has the MCP part. But I also use semantic kernel, as you know from my previous videos. And in order to store it in the vector store, I either have SQL Server or Azure AI Search. This is because when I run locally, I actually use a local SQL Server. And when I run online, I end up using the Azure AI Search. So I don't need to pay for an online SQL Server. And then I use this simple RAG, which will be something that we will go into in a separate video, but I will explain the highlights in this and then go into details in the other video. So the first thing we do in order to do this is to grab a bunch of different keys for different services. And I made a fake settings here, so all these are not real data. So look at them as you want. I have the real one down here, which is not on GitHub, so I don't get hacked or anything. But what we need is an Azure AI endpoint, like we have done with all the rest of the things. And while you can put all the different models and stuff in here, the only one we really need is a text embedding, and I'll use this one, text embedding small, because it works with more or less every single vector store out there in the world. So that is one of the services we need to use. If you don't know what this is, see some of my other videos. Next up is, so this was the endpoint with the key that we need for that, and the embedding model. Then, if you want to use SQL Server, you of course need to have a SQL Server connection string. If you want to run local, you need to run the new beta of SQL Server 2025. But else it can just run up in Azure AI Search. And up there in Azure AI Search, which I have here, I get my URL and I can get my keys from down here, which are hidden for right here now. But I use my primary admin key. If I really wanted to log it down, I would make some query keys instead as well. And then I need a GitHub token. So that is just the normal tokens up in GitHub. So I can go in here and I can go to my settings, and down in developer settings, I have my key to do this. And that key, if we look at it, I need to quickly log in here. There we're logged in. All it needs to do is, let me That is actually not the right key. Let me find the right one. We need the personal access token key. Here it is. And this is my key, which just have read access to my code. And in my case, I also give it pull request, but that's not needed for this scenario. So you just need to make a key. And then we have everything we need. Then we need to add the Azure OpenAI embeddings generator because we need embeddings. So we just give the Azure AI endpoint key and embedding. And then we need to choose what our vector store should be called. In my case, I've just called it Trello.net vector sources. Nothing special. And whenever I search, I want to max search for 50 things. Then you can use SQL Server. So SQL Server would just be a connection string and then an embedding generator. And Azure AI Search is just a Azure Search client and an embedding generator. So in real code, you don't need to make multiple, but of course, I've just adjusted here so I can easily switch between the two. Then I need to have two functions. I need to have a sync repo and I need to ask a question. If we look at the ask a question first, it is, as you saw in my previous video about MCP in Azure Function, where we just have an MCP tool trigger. I call my tool Trello.net Code Assistant, give it a description, say I can give a question and a description of that question. And then I use the search here, which comes from single rack. And I just send the data back without me almost not doing anything here. The only thing I have is I have that this is my table. And inside that table will be multiple records. Some of them will be code, some of them will be markdown, and they all belong to what I call a collection of Trello.net. So if you had multiple repos that you wanted to store in the same vector store, you could, but in my case, I only have one. And then I do my syncing of the data, which is that I just check if I have my API key to be able to sync my repo. And we can start a repo sync here. If I run the code up here, start it out. So now my repo is running. And I get an MCP server endpoint, and I get a sync repo endpoint. And if I go to Postman and sync my repo, we will see, whoops, not that one, this one, that it begins to actually download the files from GitHub. And after that, it would check which of the things are missing in my vector store and embed the rest of it, what has been deleted since last time, and get rid of that. So in my case, my vector store is up to date. We can see the vector store up here, where we can see the index. And inside I have 1,300 entries. And if I search here, they are all entries with some data and the vector. And as you can see, I've roughly spent half of my storage. So if I had much more code or many more repos, I would begin to need to pay or use a different source here. But what is happening here behind the scenes is, again, it's downloading the data because I don't want to be dependent on having a clone of the repo. And once it's done with downloading, as you see here, it begins to embed the data, but because everything is up to date, it's done. And now it begins to embed my markdown files. So if we look at this in code, again, I have a API key in order for me to only be the one that can sync the repo. And then I say the repo I want to sync is owned by me, and the repo is called Trello.net. And then this simple rag, which is just a NuGet package, as we can see here. And again, I will explain it in much more detail in the other video. Takes over, and I can just say I want to await an ingestion of various data sources. And the various data sources can be, in so far, it can be, show them here. It can either be a C# source from GitHub, local, Markdown from GitHub, and local. So right now, simple rag is only meant for C# code and Markdown. Later on, if it becomes a success, I will add PDFs and all kinds of other sources that you will be able to ingest in this. But what I'm doing here is I'm just saying I have a C# data source of GitHub that I give the collection ID of Trello.net and the ID of it being code. It should work from my source folder up in Trello.net here, which I will go in here. And it should go from this folder and inward all the code except my tests, because I don't want them to be part of this, and take it from this GitHub. There's a few more settings you can set here, but else it just takes some defaults. In the same manner, I make a Markdown source where I take some all the Markdown I have in the repo, because I have my wiki here as all the MD files I have. And I simply take that and chunk it down to third level, because the data behind the scenes is being chunked. So for example, a C# class is being turned into what constructors does it have, what methods does it have, and so on. And each file is turned into at least one, but most likely multiple different vector store data. Again, the other video will show that part. But this is the only thing I need to do. So if you don't care about all the behind the scenes stuff and you just want your repo to be ragged, you only need to write these lines of code and then you're done. So we can see down here, it's actually done here with all the data. It embedded both stuff. And we are done with the syncing part. And what I intend to do is I will make this sync be part of my workflow. So when I release a new version, it will automatically also sync the new version data into the vector store. Or I could do it every night if I felt like I needed to not detect a new version. Then we of course also saw that we had the trigger, which is here. And that trigger I have put online. So I have, in general, I put all of this online, of course, in this backend. So I have my sync and I have my ask questions. And of course, I need some app key. There's a special app key. I showed that in my other video, but I've just turned it into tools, so it's easy to understand. And beyond that, it is just calling these tools. So ask a question is the one that is actually being used from MCP. So if we switch to Visual Studio Code here, where I have a small C# program I normally use Visual Studio Code because it's best so far at MCP, but Visual Studio can also do it, Cursor can do it, and so on. And then I add a server. So you can go up here and say add server, and you need to tell it it's an HTTP server and give the URL. And then you end up with a file like this, where I have my tool running. I have one tool, and that tool I can see in here, which is my MCP Trello.net assistant that we can call. In order for AI to better understand that, oh, yes, I actually know something about Trello.net, but this knows more, I tend to add some GitHub Copilot instructions, where I essentially just tell it a small thing about, hey, you should always use the MCP tool instead of your general knowledge whenever you work with that. And I give it some examples because I have a namespace that are a bit hard to understand because the namespace and a class is the same. So I just, whenever I tell this to other people that they should use my MCP, is I think these are good instructions to start out with, to put them into your project together with the MCP. And once we have that, we can simply make it do code. So add a card via Trello.net. And if I do that, it will begin to call my assistance here. So it asks the question, how do I do this? It came back with data, lots of different data based on my vector search with the similarities. And as you can see, it came back and actually made some code. And compared to the code that ChatGPT can do, this is actually real code. And I could do much more advanced stuff. And in general, now that it knows the code, it is very efficient at writing good code. We can try and see if we can give it some more advanced stuff. So let's try to delete the code, make it a new thing here, and let's give it a bigger question that I'm new to Trello.net. If I don't know the system, I need to do some different columns in the system. I need to do some labels. Again, if you're not familiar with Trello, this will not make too much sense. But again, this is just plain text of someone explaining, knowing what Trello is, but having no clue what the API can do, and giving that to the system should hopefully taking a little longer because there's multiple things here, and it will ask multiple times of how do I add lists, how do I add boards, and so on and so forward. So it's just asking, and every time it calls, yes, it cost me a few tokens for the embedding, but beyond that, there's no cost to me after I've embedded the system, other than running the Azure function, which again is also cheap. So now it's done doing the different things. It made a little mistake and now it changed that after the fact. And it has now completed the script, and I can quickly check. Yeah, it's correct. That's correct path. This is the correct way of doing it. It's the correct way of doing that. Yeah. Yes, and it even got something small details like these correct. Again, if you're not familiar with Trello, of course, this is not code, but given that I've written both systems, I know that this is actually correct code. And I think that's everything. Again, if we go back to these slides, if I can find them. Let's do this. So with almost no money and with a few lines of code, you can actually do this. And again, even if it's a private repo and you are someone who exposes that repo to some end users of yours, you could even do this as well and not give them access to the code. Again, I haven't explained simple rag yet. I will do that in the next video. But beyond that, I hope this was inspiring to see a real end-to-end system instead of just small bits and pieces. If there's any questions, leave them in the comments. Else, thank you for this time.